Hi, everybody. I'm going to do chapters 6 and 8 in the same video because chapter 6 is really short. So we'll go through chapter 6 and then I will share the screen and change the PowerPoint from chapter 6 to chapter 8. So this video contains chapters 6 and 8. So chapter 6 is analyzing the audience. So that means being thoughtful about who makes up the group that you're speaking to. For your purposes, most of the people in your classes are going to be in a similar age range to yourself and in the same generation. Sometimes we might have a much older or even potentially a much younger student, but typically you're going to be in the same generation. So knowing that might help you think specific things about how best to reach the people in your audience, and that would be called audience analysis. So when we are preparing for our speech, when we're doing anything that relates to our speech, we are always thinking about the people who are going to be listening to it and the goal that we have as it pertains to that audience. What do we want them to know, believe, or do? So we're thinking, to whom am I speaking? What do I want them to know, believe, or do? And what is the most effective way of accomplishing that? So there's a question on your exam, something along the lines of, when in speech preparation do we want to be audience centered? And it's all the time. I believe the answer is all of the above. It's when we're preparing, it's when we're giving the speech, it's when we're looking for sources, it's the whole time. So we're keeping our audience foremost in mind during speech preparation and presentation. And again, that means that we are audience centered. We are thinking about them, and everything that we're doing, we are filtering the choices that we're making through that audience centeredness. Egocentrism is what we're battling against to be audience centered, because human beings tend to be concerned with ourselves, with our own values, our own beliefs, and our own well being. So we need to trade out that mirror that we might be seeing the world through, because we're not really seeing the world through it, and trade it out for a window. And so if we think about it like that, it's less about us. Not that we aren't important, not that your voice isn't important. Of course it is. But we can't forget the public part of the public speaking. This is for an audience. It would be like if you were a chef and you spent all this time preparing food that you liked with no regard for who might be eating it, right? So you're going to be serving your food to someone, and you would be thinking about whether or not they're likely to get the experience you want them to have. That's analogous to this public speaking model that we're discussing. So, how can we show the audience that we're thinking of them? Well, we can do things like identification, identifying with our audience, emphasizing the common values, goals, and experiences. We see that a lot in election seasons when the candidate is trying to reach across demographic lines and say, I am not like you in these ways, maybe, but I am like you in these maybe even more important ways. We have different backgrounds or different cultural experiences, but that doesn't mean that we're fundamentally different. And so I'm looking for that bridge so that I can bridge whatever gaps might be perceived or might actually be there. We just have to be careful that we don't go so far as to appropriate an experience that isn't our experience. So it's a way to acknowledge differences and even find a way to celebrate those differences, but not emphasize them at the expense of similarities, if we think about it like that. So these are the different factors we might consider in demographic analysis. So demographic is another way to think about group membership. So age, gender, religion, sexual orientation, racial, ethnic, cultural background, and pretty much anything else goes in group membership. So things like athletes, things like left-handed people, things like things like lacrosse players versus football players inside the group of athletes, right? So these are all different groups, Boy Scouts, right? These are all different groups we might identify with because they shape part of who we are and how we move through the world. So the more kind of defined groups are represented in the categories above. And we have to be very careful. We're going to talk about this a little bit. we have to be very careful not to use this information to stereotype or to treat cultures or ethnicities or races or religions or any of that, or ages or anything on this list. We don't want to treat them like a monolith, meaning that in campaign season, for example, you'll hear the candidates talk about the Hispanic vote. And one of the responses to that concept is that every Hispanic is not going to vote the same way, and every Hispanic is not the same demographic within that demographic. So a Cuban American versus a Mexican American versus a Spanish person, whose lineage is from Spain, all of those demographic, and there are more, right? Venezuelan, Ecuadorian, all of these things. So there are so many different ways and channels to lead you to identify as a Hispanic person, that even looking at it like it's one box is really risky, and you can get into stereotyping territory. So we don't want to assume that all members of any group are alike. We just want to use as much insight as we can without going even close to the line of stereotyping. And so here's an example. Let's say that a speaker wants to give a speech that is pro-choice. It is pro women's reproductive rights, and ultimately the speaker hopes to persuade us that Roe v. Wade should be reinstated and that abortion should be perceived legally as a constitutional right, and they're overturning the recent Supreme Court ruling. So let's say that that's the speaker's goal. And I'm not advocating for that viewpoint versus the opposing viewpoint. I'm just using that as an example. So if I am going to do that speech and I do a survey ahead of time, and I realize that most of the people who are going to be in my audience are older than typical reproductive ages, right? Let's say that everybody in my audience is over 50, and most of them are men, and most of them are Catholic, and most of them identify as straight, and most of them identify as Christian. Well, I already said Catholic. Let's say most of them identify as, let's say, wealthy, because that could be group membership, right? So, yeah, let's look at that. And maybe let's throw in another cultural background or ethnic background. Let's say that they identify as Irish Catholic, even. So does that mean that I change my position? No, but it may be a different, I'm still going to the same destination, but I might drive a different car. I might take a different route. I might have different methods. I mentioned this in another video. In acting class, we have objectives, obstacles, and tactics. What does the character want? What's in their way? And how can they get through or around or over what's in their way to get what they want, to get the objective? And so my tactics might be different than if I did that same survey and most of the people I found were under 25. Most of them were women. Most of them identified as atheists. Most of them identified as LGBTQ. And most of them identified as liberal Democrats, right? That would be another group membership, or even potentially cultural background, depending on how you look at it. So that would be a different car that I'd drive, and I'd take a different route to that same topic, right? So it just factors in how you might approach it. And one of the ways that we might approach it is by doing or having what's called a mental dialogue, which we're going to talk about once we get into persuasive speech making chapters 16 and 17. But I'll just preview that concept. I might say something to the first group that I mentioned. I might say something like, I know that many of you identify as Catholic. Many of you in this room identify as Catholic, and you may be opposed to abortion for the following reasons. And then I would list some reasons. But to you, I would argue, or I would say, please consider, and then I would counter that point respectfully. I would acknowledge the potential for difference, but I also wouldn't say, I know that many of you in this room are Catholic, and so I know that you feel this way, because they're not a monolith, and I don't know that they feel that way. I know that they potentially view things that way because of the teachings of their faith and the Pope and all of the things that I know about through absorbing that information, but not experientially because I'm not a Catholic. So it's a way for me to be respectful, to acknowledge the differences, but also not to back down on challenging their potential opposition, right? So I know that most of you in this room are single, most of you in this room are young, and most of you in this room are women. And to you, I say, imagine yourself in a position where you need to terminate a pregnancy. And that might be what I say, right? I can also do this. Now, I know I'm using an example of being pro choice when I'm giving this example, but you can use the same methods if you're pro life, if you're arguing the other side, if you're trying to convince people that Roe v. Wade should not be reinstated. So when we're persuading, we're trying to create, reinforce, or change the audience's mind about something, all with the same speech within the people who are there, right? We're going to talk more about that in chapter 16 and 17 too. So it's a way of for me to acknowledge the differences, to try to bridge the gaps in those differences, but also not to make too many assumptions about what those differences definitely mean. Maybe you could argue that I'm making assumptions about what they could mean, but a lot of that is statistics driven, right? And that's where research becomes important. So in this instance, I might cite a source, which I'm going to talk about in chapter 8. I might say something like, according to the National Coalition for Young Catholics. I made that up. That might be a real thing, but if it is, it's a coincidence. But I might cite something that speaks to the assumption that I might be making about how they are likely to view things, right? So there's no way around making certain assumptions, but they need to be informed assumptions, and we need to be very careful to toe the line so we are not getting into stereotyping territory. And it is delicate. And I think the most important thing is to remember to be open to feedback if from the listeners, from the professor, from our peers, if we go too far in that demographic analysis. But that's the concept of demographic analysis. So again, we want to be careful about stereotyping, which is oversimplifying an image of a group, thinking like all people from this area think this way or feel this way or do these things or live like this, right? You're assuming all members are alike. It's sort of like saying to yourself, oh, I know my way through every forest because I touched a tree one time. That's silly and it sounds silly. That's what stereotyping is. Everybody's different. And one thing that we need to consider too when we're thinking about stereotyping is it keeps us from getting to know people on a more nuanced basis, and it comes from a place of trying to convince ourselves that we understand a big, wide, scary world. Because if you think about it, animal stereotype, if I'm in the woods and a deer who is not used to humans comes by me, they're not going to give me a chance to prove that I'm not going to hurt them, right? They're going to run away because they're going to think new, different than me, threat, run away, right? That deer is stereotyping me. So it's a way of having self-preservation. It's a way of checking a box and convincing ourselves, oh, I know how to deal with this potential threat or this potential encounter, even if it's not a threat. I understand how to navigate this social situation, or I understand how to handle this type of stimulus because I've done it before and I can check that box off, and now the world is less scary to me. I know how to react when a human being's in the woods and I'm a deer. I'm running away, right? So that's how stereotypes kind of happened. It's a way of our brains giving us the illusion of control in a world that we cannot control. And it's a very primal thing. And it's driven by self-preservation. But the thing that we have that other animals don't have is the ability to reason. And we get that ability at around age 7. And so we have the ability to have a thought, but not act on that thought, and even sometimes act in opposition of that thought. So there's a lot of thought as it connects to behavior options that we have through that ability to reason that other animals don't have. So we need to exercise that ability to reason and think through and check ourselves so that we're not stereotyping. So if we were in person, or even live on Zoom, we would take this oral quiz together. So what 5 factors are considered in situational audience analysis? So we've got demographic analysis, and then we've got situational. So situational has to do with more of the circumstance of the speech itself. and this is on your exam. What is the size of the crowd and the size of the room? I'm going to give a different speech if I'm giving a speech to 10 people in a ballroom, or I'm giving a speech to 100 people in a tiny classroom that's too small. Or there's a, you know, if it's loud, if it's cold, if it's hot, if it's really quiet, if I don't have a good microphone, if my microphone is too sensitive, all of these things factor into size and then physical setting. And then disposition is another way to think of attitude. So the speaker's attitude toward the topic, toward the speaker, toward the occasion. If I'm giving a speech about 9/11 on 9/12/2001, I'm going to have to be very, very reverent. I should be reverent anyway, right? But it just happened. It's fresh. I have to be very, very respectful. I have to be very reflective and very sensitive to the freshness of the occasion. It's going to be still reverent, still somber, still reflective, and all of those things if I'm giving the speech a year later on the anniversary of 9/11 versus the 20th anniversary of 9/11 versus the I'm giving a speech on 9/11 on a random Wednesday in a public speaking class, right? So that all has to do with the attitude toward the occasion. Where are we? How fresh is the topic I'm talking about? And then also the disposition or the attitude toward the topic itself, right? And then also potentially the audience's attitude toward the speaker. And the speaker needs to be aware of these things, but the audience needs to be aware of their tendency to stereotype the speaker and try to battle against that as well. So assuming that a speaker doesn't have anything to offer because they're different than we are and we don't want to learn from them, right? And we are arrogant enough to assume that we can't learn from them or that we already know what they're going to say. And so we tune them out. We don't learn anything. Or assuming that the speaker is going to say something we do agree with because we do check similar demographic boxes and we don't listen to them because we automatically assume they're going to be in agreement with us. So the audience is also battling against their tendency to be egocentric. And so all of those things we would factor in. If I am a woman of reproductive age giving a speech about abortion rights, whatever my stance is, the audience is probably going to perceive me a little bit differently than if I am an older man giving the same speech, right? And so just being aware of those topics and why would they perceive us differently? And I'm not even saying favorably or unfavorably, I'm just saying different because one speaker is in a demographic box that is going to be disproportionately directly affected more so than the other demographic that I mentioned. Okay. So all of these things have to do with factoring in how to approach our speech. We don't need to look at that. Okay. So that is chapter 6. Now I'm going to go into chapter 8. So chapter 8 is about supporting materials, which essentially answer the following questions. What do you mean? Why should I believe you? And so what? Why does this matter to me? And the more and more people are, love you mean it, addicted to your smartphones, the less they are inclined to come out of them and find any value in anything that's not on that phone. So we really have our work cut out for us. So how do we support our ideas? So there are 3 types of supporting materials that are on your exam in a multiple choice or a true and false question. And those types are examples, statistics, and testimony. And we're going to go through each of them. So an example is a specific case meant to illustrate an idea. So if I say, for instance, or I tell a story, that's an example to help you understand. And there are 3 types of examples. Brief, which is just a cutaway. If I were to say, for instance, a student athlete might speak about NIL. That's a quick, brief cutaway. But if I tell a story about a student who was an athlete who did speak about NIL, that might be extended. That's a longer one. And hypothetical is something that's fictitious, it's fictional, it hasn't happened yet, but it's believable as something that could happen. So if I were to say, imagine that you've been charged with a crime you didn't commit and you're on death row about to be executed. Certain studies, and I'll quote the specific studies, show that this has been the reality potentially for other people, and this is why I oppose the death penalty. That might be an example of a hypothetical example. So again, a brief example is a specific case referred to in passing, so quickly to illustrate a point. An extended example is a story, a narrative, or an anecdote developed at length to illustrate a point. If you can hear that rattling that sounds like the ghost of Christmas past, it's my dog shaking his collar. A hypothetical example, again, is describing a fictitious situation, something that hasn't happened but is believable, something that could happen, so our audience can imagine themselves in that position. So we use examples to clarify our ideas, which is another way to say make them more clear, and to reinforce them, to back them up. If you bring it up, you got to back it up. To personalize it, especially when we're dealing with statistics and figures and numbers, we want to humanize them so people understand the impact of those things. Make them vivid and richly textured, especially if you're telling a story, and practice your delivery so you are thoughtful and intentional about how you convey these things. So this is on your exam. There's a quick question about it. These are important statistical measures for you to know if you are giving a speech, especially a speech topic that might be really, really current, and there aren't a lot of graphs. The research is still kind of new, and you would be able to use this information to make these statistics more accessible and to potentially make a graph for your audience. So these are three basic statistical concepts. The first one is mean, which is another way to say average. So if I were to add up all of the grades in the speech classes and I divide them by 24, which is the number of students I have, that would be the mean. That would be the average grade. So if the average grade is an 89, that would be the mean grade, okay? The median grade is the middle figure in the group once the figures are ordered from highest to lowest. So if I were to take the grades and I put all the A's first, and then the B's, the C's, the D's, the F's, I put them all together, the lowest grade is going to be at the end, and the highest grade is going to be at the beginning, and then the middle figure is going to be the median grade. Now, if I have 24, then I've got 12 and 12, right? There's not a clean single middle. So I would take the middle two figures and then divide those, and that would give me the median grade. And the mode, let's say that I look at my grades and I'm like, wow, a lot of people have grades of 74, right? That is the number that occurs the most frequently, and that would be the mode. You see this kind of measurement done when people are talking about income a lot. So use your statistics to quantify your ideas. Another way to back them up, make them more clear. Use them sparingly, because people can get overwhelmed with ideas like that are number based. So use them sparingly. They're meant to back up your ideas. They're not the ideas themselves, if that makes sense. Identify your sources so that we can trust what you're saying. Explain the relevance thoroughly, and round off. If you got a whole bunch of decimal points, round off, round up even to the nearest, but don't round so far up that it's not rounding. You're distorting the statistic, right? So just round off, and use visual aids if needed. We talked about that in chapter 14. Testimony is another word to describe quotations or paraphrases that are used to support a point. Where do we hear testimony? We hear testimony in church. We hear testimony in a courtroom. So those are people who are talking to prove their point. So, and they're using quotes or paraphrases. So they can be giving their direct testimony, or somebody else can be giving testimony about what they heard someone else say or what they saw. So there are different types of different types of testimony. The first is expert testimony, and this is really important in our influencer celebrity worship culture. Just because someone is an expert in something doesn't mean they're an expert in everything. So we've got these two guys in these space suits, and that guy you can see has NASA. I'm assuming the other one does, and it's just covered. But he has a NASA logo on his jumpsuit. And so we can assume that he is an expert in things that are science-based, maybe space-based. I don't know exactly what he does for NASA, but if he's talking about space, if he's talking about science, I'm going to recognize him as an expert. But if he's talking about politics, even though he's really smart and accomplished, at that point, he's giving peer testimony, because he doesn't know any more than your average informed person if he's not credentialed in it. And so when we hear celebrities talk about things that they're not experts in, sometimes we think that they know more than we do. and we will follow their lead as though they're experts, but they're not. A famous example is Tom Cruise came under a lot of fire for speaking out against the practice of psychiatry, specifically as it relates to the treatment of postpartum depression. He was responding to a book. He was on, I think, the Today Show, and he was promoting a movie, if I recall correctly. And Brooke Shields, who is an actress and model, had come out with a book about her experience with postpartum depression and what helped her. And part of what helped her was psychiatry and, I believe, medication. I didn't read the book, but if memory serves, it was a combination of medication and therapy. And for whatever reason, Tom Cruise took it upon himself. You can look the clip up on YouTube. Took it upon himself to talk about how psychiatry was a pseudoscience. It wasn't a real science, and psychiatric medicines were false and fake, and people shouldn't trust them. And people were like, what do you know about postpartum depression? What do you know about psychiatry? And he thought because he was a famous movie star, people would listen to him. And some people maybe did, but he ended up apologizing and, all the usual backtracking. But that's a famous example of someone who is in the public eye. People will say use your platform, and there's absolutely a place for that, but you're using your platform as a peer. You're not using your platform just because you have a platform doesn't make you an expert. It just makes you a very visible peer. So what is peer testimony? It's testimony from ordinary people, because if Katy Perry is telling you who to vote for, she doesn't know any more about who to vote for than you do, as long as you look up the candidates. Y'all are just as smart as she is. Y'all are just as capable of learning about who to vote for based on your experience as informed citizens as she is. So in that instance, she's an ordinary person, just like you're my peer and I'm your peer outside of public speaking, right? So sorry, hold on one second. My dog is going crazy. Okay, come here. I'm not going to pause the video because it'll mess it up. I just need to unleash him because he's acting a fool. There you go. Okay. So peer testimony is testimony from ordinary people with firsthand experience and insight. And it doesn't matter how visible they are, they're still your peers if they're not credentialed. Like, I am not your peer in public speaking. I'm your professor because I'm an expert in this field, and you're paying to learn what I have expertise in. But if we're just talking about candidates, we're talking about social issues, we're talking about elections, we're peers. We're peers. I'm an American, you're an American. Our vote counts the same. So just remember that. A direct quote is when you present testimony that is word for word, and you're saying this is exactly what this person said. We need to be careful not to quote those things out of context, because if you eliminate the context, it can distort the purpose, the spirit, the words, and everything around it. So for instance, I just said a minute ago, I'm not your peer, right? I'm not your peer when it comes to public speaking, but I am your peer when it comes to basically anything else, like political stuff and elections and all that. If you were to go and say, Professor Butler said we're peers. Professor Butler said, I'm your peer. Are you technically right? Yeah, but you've eliminated all the context around it. And then that could be distorted into like, I'm trying to be your buddy. I'm trying to be your pal, your friend, or hang out with you or whatever. And that's not the truth. So that would be an out of context quote. An example of that is, I once told a student, just like if you were to show up to basketball practice and you have your shoes tied together, or you're laying down on the court, you're not coachable. It doesn't matter how prepared the coach is and how much the coach wants to help you. You've made yourself uncoachable because the coach can't reach you. You could be the best, I could be the best track coach in the world, but if you insist on lying down at the starting line or not wearing your shoes, I can't help you run faster or better. You're not coachable at that point. So she was a student who had not, she was a theater student. She had not learned her lines at all, and I couldn't direct her. And I said, so in this moment, not that you're not teachable in the grand scheme of things, but I can't teach you anything today. You're not teachable today because you're not prepared. So I can't direct you. I can't do anything. So she told everybody I said she was not teachable, which technically, did I say that? Yes, technically, but there was a lot around that. I didn't just say, you're not teachable, and then, peace out. So those are instances where people might have a different impression of the intent of the speaker when you eliminate the surrounding phrases. So that would be an example of an out of context quote. So we have to be careful not to distort also when we paraphrase. And paraphrasing is restating a source's ideas in your own words. But the ideas still belong to the person who had them. And if you steal those ideas without credit, even if you paraphrase, you're still plagiarizing. So make sure that you quote and paraphrase accurately, use qualified sources and unbiased sources that can be trusted, and identify your sources. Why should we trust them? And why did you pick them? Maybe that sort of information. And we'll talk more about that in a second. So these are the most important slides of chapter 8. It's the penultimate slide, which is the second to last slide, the one that we're on now, and then the last one. So these two slides that we're covering, this one and then the one right after it, make friends with these two slides. So what do you need in your oral citation? Well, first of all, what is an oral citation? Well, it's an oral citation because you say it with your mouth in your speech. And what does it include? It needs to have the name of the document. So that might be the name of the website. That might be the name of a book. It might be the name of an article. If it's the name of an article, I need the larger document as well. So if it's an article on a website, I need the article name and the website name. If it's an article in a journal, same thing. I need the journal name and the article name. I need who's responsible for the information. Like if you were spreading false information and somebody wanted to sue you, who would they sue? So I need the author. And if you can't find the actual human person who generated it, I need to know who's responsible for the content. So who runs the website, who sponsors the website. I need qualifications. Why should we trust them? And then I need the date that it's published and or the date that you pulled it if you can't find a published date. So I'm going to give you an example in a second, but something like according to ANE.com, which is the official website of Arts and Entertainment Television, a long-running television network. And then I would continue on with what I pulled from that website. Now, hear me say this. If your source citation is getting clunky, if it's a mouthful, if it's just not, you're having a hard time with it, I will be flexible on the date as long as the date of publish or like the date that it was published or the date that you pulled it are not relevant to the information itself on the surface. For example, if I'm given a speech about the evolution of psychiatry and I cite an explanation of schizophrenia that is from the 1940s or autism or something like that, and then I don't tell you it's from the 1940s and I present it as though it's a current definition, it's changed a lot. The understanding of mental health has changed a lot. And so that's one where I would need to say the date that it was published. But I'll be flexible on the date as long as it's not important in that way. So if you need to drop the date, I'm not flexible on the other three. So here's what an oral citation would look like. And you say this with your mouth, which means it is written out. I should see it written out on your preparation outline because your preparation outline contains virtually everything you plan to say. So I should see these and it should have its own letter or number in the visual framework and be a complete sentence. This is what the source citation will look like. Kenneth Chang, who's that? That's the author. Science reporter. Oh, those are his qualifications. For the New York Times. Oh, that is the sponsoring organization and the name of the document. We got lucky there because the New York Times is an organization and it's a paper. Now, for this one, I would need to be clear. Am I using the website or am I using the actual physical newspaper? So I might say, Kenneth Chang, science reporter for the New York Times on the New York Times website, newyorktimes.com, if it's on the website. But this is a physical paper. So let's go back again. Kenneth Chang, Science reporter, the fact that he's a science reporter is enough to give me his credentials. Kenneth Chang, science reporter for the New York Times, reported in the papers, March 13th, 2011 issue. All of that, boom. I've got the qualifications right there from Kenneth all the way to 2011. That gives me those. Okay. See that? Name of document, the New York Times. Author and sponsoring organization, I've got both. The author is Kenneth Chang, and the sponsoring organization is also the New York Times because it's both the name of the paper and the name of the company. Qualifications, he's a science reporter. Date, March 13th, 2011. Kenneth Chang, science reporter for the New York Times, reported in the paper's March 13th, 2011 issue that the recent quake in Japan widened the country by 13 feet. And then I would have another letter number for the second sentence. It also tilted the Earth's axis and shortened the day by a couple millionths of a second. So obviously I'm giving a speech, and this oral citation is to support my contention, or if it's not persuasive, because we can't really tell from this one, or my information, I'm telling you about the damage that earthquakes cause, right? So it would be relevant that way. So I'm backing up something. If I'm trying to tell you that earthquakes change the landscape, if you didn't know that, if you didn't know that earthquakes, every time there's an earthquake, it changes the earth a little bit. For instance, Kenneth Chang, science reporter for the New York Times, and boom, now I know, okay, why that's relevant. And that is chapter 8. These two slides are super important. So, and also remember to use qualified sources, unbiased sources, identify the sources, and make sure your paraphrases and your quotes are accurate. Boom, boom. That is chapter 8. I'm about to put this on YouTube.